Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil mursaleen Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in wa ba'd. I must really thank our brother Dato Dr. Jamil for inviting me to present this talk to all of you, and I think I will take you on an exciting journey of the legacy of Islam in South Africa, inshallah wa ta'ala. And thank you for all of you for attending, and I hope you will benefit, and I look forward to the questions if you have any at the end of my presentation, inshallah wa ta'ala. So you can see this is the map of South Africa. All right, you can see the map. So the main where the Muslims actually, where Islam actually where Islam came Islam came to the most important cities are Cape Town and then Durban. That these are the cities that are important for the growth of Islam in South Africa. Of course, there are other later on, but these were the two main cities were Cape Town and Durban. So now, what we have to understand is that prior to the colonization of South Africa, no one residing in South Africa professed Islam. So Islam was introduced in South Africa by Muslims who were brought in as slaves or political prisoners and as mercenaries from Southeast Asia to the Cape in the 17th and 18th centuries. In Natal, Islam was introduced with the arrival of Muslims who were brought over by the British as indentured laborers and from India in the 19th century. Eventually, there were whites and black Africans who accepted Islam, but on their own volition. And Muslim population today comprises approximately 3% of the total 60 million population of South Africa. So now we start with the presence of Islam in the Cape. And then what we have to understand is that colonization, as I mentioned, is responsible in bringing Islam to the Cape from Southeast Asia, Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. So they were brought in, the Muslims were brought in as slaves, as mercenaries, servants, and political exiles. So the slaves, as far as the slaves are concerned, there's a person by the name of Jan van Riebeeck, the first colonizer to set foot at the Cape on 6 April 1652. And the mercenaries and servants, they were free Muslims from Moluccan Islands, arrived in 1658. They were called the Mahdikas and employed by the Dutch to protect Dutch settlement against indigenous groups. And some of them served as servants to the Dutch settlers. Now, as far as the political exiles are concerned, in Southeast Asia, where the Dutch were, where we can say where Indonesia is today, there was fierce resistance against the Dutch in places like Cambodia, Batavia, and the Moluccans. It led to the steady flow of political prisoners who were banished to the Cape. For example, if you look at the history of Seychelles, where I was born, the same thing happened because the British were ruling in certain places when they have problems with the Palestinians and so on. Then in Egypt also, then they sent political prisoners to Seychelles. This is what they did here also. So Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, now it's important to mention him, but as far as the growth of Islam, we'll see that he had nothing to do, but he was an important person. But as far as the growth of Islam in South Africa, his name may only be mentioned, but there's no contribution per se. So he married the daughter of Sultan of Bantam. The conflict arose between the Sultan and his son. The Sultan supported the British and the son the Dutch. The Sheikh Yusuf supported the Sultan and engaged in guerrilla warfare against the Dutch for almost a year. He eventually gave himself up on a promise of pardon from the Dutch. And this is the same thing that happens, they promise, these colonizers promises, and they never fulfilled their promise. And the same thing also happened in Seychelles. You know, they did the same thing with the political exile. People were politically exiled there. So so Makassar 626 to 699. The Dutch failed to keep their promise. They promised him, but then they failed to keep the promises. Then they sentenced him to death. The sentence was commuted on appeal of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. So it's so important to understand that, you know, at that time, the emperor, you know, played a role, you know, for the Muslims around the world, you know, and it was commuted. Feeling of his influence in Java, he was exiled to Ceylon in 1684, and he arrived in the Cape in 1694 with family members and attendants as political prisoner. Accorded certain privileges, allowed to stay at a suburb in the city of Cape Town. After his death, his family and attendants repatriated his body to Makassar, Indonesia. His remains were taken to his native land and reburied at Lakyong on 23rd May 1703 at the request of the Sultan of Goa. And that is part of the Goa, the Sultan of Goa, part of the Indonesia today. Establishment of Islam. Now, this is where the story of Islam actually, you know, it starts. It was towards the end of the 18th century, two important persons, Sheikh Madura, who died in 1754, and Tuan Sayyid, died in 1760, were initially responsible in propagating and establishing Islam in South Africa. Their first students, they were teachers, and they taught the slaves, and also when I say free black Africans, mean they were not slaves, they were black Africans, indigenous population. They were, you know, taught by these two teachers about Islam, and these students of theirs also helped in propagating Islam in South Africa. But as far as consolidation of the Muslim community is concerned, you know, when we say consolidation, you know, besides teaching, what did they do, you know, that left an indelible mark in South Africa? Then we have a person by the name of Imam Abdullah Qadi Abdul Salam, affectionately known as Tuan Guru, which means master teacher, and he was born in 1712 and died in 1807. He was exiled at the Cape in 1780, and he was in prison where Mandela was in prison, where the former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, for 13 years. And in that, when he was jailed there on Robben Island, he wrote the Quran from memory. And this is significant, you know, and we still have this Quran preserved today. And it's in the Awal Masjid. They have a copy in the Awal Masjid, the first masjid there in Cape Town. So upon his release, he devoted his energies towards establishing the Islamic religious community. So this is where the consolidation of Islam began. Primary goal was to establish a masjid, the symbolic expression of the Muslim community. So a place of worship, a sanctuary, and spiritual retreat. This is how it was throughout the history of Islam. Unfortunately, later on, we lost that by making the masjid only a place for salah, that's all. But it was a place of worship, a sanctuary, and spiritual retreat. It was a space for social and political mobilization. You know, and today we don't have that, you know, that characteristics is not there. But unfortunately, because of Islamophobia, then we cannot do that today. Everywhere in the world, we will not be allowed to do that. Application for the establishment of masjid. So he realized the importance of the masjid. So he applied for it, and it was turned down, the first application made. He defied, so what he did, because he could not build a masjid, he defied the Dutch and led an open-air Friday congregational prayer in the disused quarry site in what is known today as Bokap in Cape Town. So this signified the first of a series of organized Muslim political activities against the Dutch at the Cape, or in the Cape. In 1798, he succeeded in founding the Awal Masjid in Dobb Street, Bokap, in Cape Town. And apparently it was a lady who actually inherited, the Muslim lady who inherited the land, and then that was how the Awal Masjid was built on that land. So role in boosting Muslim literacy. So Tuan Guru, in 1793, established a madrasa. And we know, all of us, even if we stay in Malaysia or anywhere in the world, in India and so on, we know it is a madrasa. It's very important, institution, Muslim institution. This is where we impart Islamic education either to the children or to adults. The strategy was to eliminate illiteracy and empower slaves and free Africans. In the first quarter of the 19th century, 500 free black Africans and slaves attended that school. So for that time, it was a big number. And this Sheikh Tuan Guru wrote textbooks on Islamic jurisprudence and related Islamic disciplines in the lingua franca of the slaves, a Dutch-based dialect, the Afrikaans dialect. So that is significant, the first printed book appeared in 1856 in Afrikaans, but in the Arabic script. It was the Afrikaans language of the Dutch, but in Arabic script. This preceded the first Afrikaans printed book in Roman script by 6 years. So this is a significant, contribution of the Muslims. The Muslim slaves contributed to the development of the African, and they actually contributed in the development of the Afrikaans language. So now we move on to the growth, how it grew in the Cape. So the growth of Islam could be attributed to conversion and intermarriages. Conversion was facilitated as a result of the assimilation by the religious schools founded by the Cape Imams. So the madrasa or the madaris were significant institutions that spread Islam and made people, convert to Islam. In the first quarter of the 19th century, there were about 3,000 Muslims in the Cape, and by the middle of that century, they had grown to 8,000. Although the original Muslims in the Cape were Malays, that name was applied to all Muslims in the Cape. So although you were of Indian origin, but you were Muslim, then you were classified as Malays. That name is a misnomer, since Islam attracted all shades and class of people in the Cape. Muslim resistance. So from the very beginning, that's why they said that the Muslims who came to South Africa, they were fighters. They were fighters. During the last quarter of the 19th century, there were several instances of collective Muslim resistance against colonial authority. Confrontation between Christians and Muslims. There was confrontation between them, and the reason is why were there confrontation? The colonial authorities and settlers at the Cape viewed Islam as a heresy. All right. So Muslims were scorned in view of the fact there was low success rate of their being converted to Christianity, being converted to Christianity. So they could not make inroads in the Muslim community to convert them. That's why there was a, resistance or confrontation between the Christians and Muslims. So the Muslims refused to be, then again, now we had the COVID, when we had the COVID pandemic all over the world, then we're speaking about this vaccination here. I don't know in Malaysia what happened, whether they were opposed vaccination. People don't trust the vaccines and so on. They think that these vaccines will make them infertile, then they won't be able to produce children and so on. So the Muslims refused to be vaccinated against smallpox during 1882 epidemic in the Cape. Why? Because they believed that disease was an affliction by the will of Allah. Mortals could not interfere with divine predestination. Religion was therefore above the law, and this conveyed a political message. So they look at all this as an opportunism of the white authorities, only concerned about poor sanitary condition among the non-white community when the whites' health was at risk. So they ignored the abject, and these whites ignored the abject living conditions of Muslims in the city. Then we had what is known as cemetery riots in 1886. Muslims resorted to civil disobedience in protest against the Health Act of 1883, which closed all cemeteries within the city due to sanitary concerns. There was a person by the name of Abdul Burns, an educated cab driver He emerged as a Muslim political activist and led a contingent of defiant Muslims to bury a, a Muslim child in the Tanabaru cemetery on the eve of the enforcement of the proclamation. Of course, his role in the cemetery riot landed him in jail for 2 months hard labor, and he was also fined. So this is the resistance that they had. The Muslims were fighters actually against injustices and against, discrimination and so on. The Muslim political expression. Now we come to the question of how Muslim now made inroads in government. So there was a person by the name of Ahmad Effendi, again in the Cape, son of Abu Bakr Effendi, was the first non-white ever to contest election to parliament in 1894. But then, as usual, the Cecil Rhodes and the Afrikaner Bond succeeded to keep him out by the introduction of legislation which disqualified him from contesting the election. But nevertheless, by the end of the Anglo-Boer War in 1902, several religious organizations were founded with different political objectives. In 1903, the short-lived South African Muslim Association was formed, and Dr. Abdullah Abdurrahman, 1870 to 1940, was active in the African People's Organization. He was from a former slave family who had purchased its freedom from slavery. He was educated in an exclusive white grammar school in Cape Town and studied medicine in Glasgow, UK. Upon his return, he practiced as a doctor, but was also actively involved in politics and education, influenced the establishment of Muslim mission schools. He was elected to the Cape Town, so this is where the inroads were made. He elected to the Cape Town City Council in 1913 and later the Provincial Council 1914 and held that position until his demise in 1940. So Muslims never gave up. Even they wanted to make inroads, they made inroads. So even in politics, they tried their best to actually participate. And then we had other organizations, that were, that came. And one was called the Cape Malay Association, the CMA, founded in 1923, a social religious organization. Some of its leaders were sympathetic to the General JBM Herzog appeal for colored and black support for the National Party. Later on, D.F. Malan was strongly supported by the CMA. In return, Malays were promised enhanced status, because there was discrimination among the various racial groups, similar to that of the colored. So they would be given a better status. But in 1948, when the Nationalist Party came into power, they did not honor their promise. Since the CMA supported the Colored Affairs Department, it was discredited within the community and ceased to exist. So again, Muslims, they had a resentment to follow the status quo. They wanted to oppose, the people that were discriminating other people on the basis of their skin color and so on. Most slaves were named. So something very important for us to understand, we find Muslims with names like Hendricks, Davids, Da Costa, Harris, etc. So most slaves were named after the slave traders who brought them and sold them, or by those who were their owners. So they took the names of their owners. That's why we find, for example, someone would be called Fuad Hendricks, or Ahmad Davids. This is because of that. Then we have the Muslim Judicial Council, and this is a very vibrant organization where the imams or the mashayikh in Cape Town. The Muslim Judicial Council in the Cape was formed in 1945. It's an offshoot of the Muslim Progressive Society, which was established in 1942, and focused on social and relief and welfare. It served as a medium to resolve religious disputes. So it was the main primary grave the primary concern was we must have unity among the Muslims. So it was to unite the Muslims, to promote education by establishment of a Muslim college. So again, we see the emphasis on Muslim unity and also the question of education. To issue religious decrees of fatwa, which were binding and final, to secure legal recognition for Muslim marriages, and we still have a problem with that. I hope it will be solved. It has not, technically been, been passed by Parliament for the legalization of Muslim marriages. And initially, it did not take any political stance. So this Muslim Judicial Council, MJC, as it is known, initially it did not take any political stance. But when Imam Harun died in detention in 1969, he took a political aggressive stance. And today, then it supported the ANC and so on. So we find that it has a history of becoming politically active. So now, the one thing again that I want you to understand is that when we speak about the migration to the Cape, that is where the Muslims came, first to the Cape by the Dutch, brought there by the Dutch. So when they came there, but what we fail to realize is that the Indians also came to South Africa, not in the 9th century by the British, but before that. The truth that Indians were also brought as slaves by the Dutch in the 17th century from Bengal. And then the Coromandel coast region, that is the southeastern coast of the Indian subcontinent within Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh states in South India and Kerala. So they were also brought to the Cape. But they were assimilated, as we said, and they became to be known as Malays. Although they were Indian origin, they were recognized as Malays and accepted as Malays. So if they intermarried, with the people that came from Indonesia before, then they would be, all considered as Cape Malays. They were assimilated by the Southeast community, and the identity was subsumed by the generic title of Malay. The Cape Muslims is actually correct name. If we say the Cape Muslims rather than Cape Malays, then might be a better term for the Muslims that reside there. Cape Muslim culture is a combination of Indian and Malay culture. So the culture, because of the Indians that were brought from Bengal and so on, so then we must say, and we must accept that the Cape Muslim culture is a combination of both Indian and Malay culture. Indian Muslims who migrated to the Cape in 1892 established the Quwwatul Islam Masjid, which they patronized. So, because of the ethnic, we have that if you go to the West, I'm not sure about Malaysia, but if you go to the West, we find, even in England, we find certain masajid, they are controlled by ethnicity. If you belong to, particular, part of India and so on, then you control that mosque and another mosque and so on. So they patronized the Quwwatul Islam Masjid in the Cape. So then let's come now to Natal. So in the 19th century, the British brought indentured workers from India to cultivate sugarcane on the coast of Natal. So this was the first time that the British actually brought the people. Now, when they say they brought indentured laborers, and people say, when you read all the books on South African history or Muslim in South Africa, you'll find that they were actually like slaves. The indentured workers were actually like slaves from India. Muslim constituted only 10% of these workers. So among those that were brought, the Muslims constituted only 10% of these workers. Among the Indians who migrated to South Africa from India, Mauritius, and East Africa, Muslims were in the majority. So they came as business people and so on. They not as indentured laborers. They only 10% of the people that came, brought by the British as indentured laborers were actually Muslims. So a small contingent, then we have to understand also, take note also that the small contingent of the Pathan Muslims were brought from India by Lord Roberts to fight on the side of the British against the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War. Because Pathans, they were like, military people, very strong and so on. So they were brought over to assist them in the fight against the British. Now we come to the strengthening of Islam in Natal. Muslim traders moved from the coast into the interior towns of Natal and went further north into the Transvaal colony. So we said, when they came to, for example, the city of Durban, that is in Natal or the Natal province. Then they moved, the Muslim traders, they made inroads. They went right inside in the far off, places where there was no electricity or whatever. They opened the shops and so on. And then they slowly moved into the Transvaal. That is where Johannesburg and so on is, It's today's, the Gauteng province is called. So the first masjid in Natal was built in 1884, within 30 years of the arrival of Muslims in that city. So that is, something to be commended for. It is known as they corrupt it. They say Juma Masjid by Jumu'ah Masjid, and also as the Grey Street Masjid. But now, because the name has changed now, it's Dr. Yusuf Dado's street, so it's no more Grey Street Masjid, but it was all before known as Grey Street Masjid because of the Grey Street where it is located. So this masjid served the traders who had settled in the city center, and the mosque became the focal point for the community life. But again, on the basis of ethnicity, the Indians, then we see what happened again. The Gujarati-speaking Muslims within a year, in 1885, established their own masjid, which was known as the West Street Masjid. So the Grey Street Masjid was built, or the Juma Masjid was built by the Memon community, financed the Grey Street Masjid. It also came to be known as the Memon Masjid. And then the West Street Masjid came to be known as the Surti Masjid, again on ethnic grounds. But that's by the way, but we should know that. That's what the history. But today, if you go to these two masajid, you'll find that the majority of people that are praying in these two masajid, right in the center of the Durban town, they're actually of African origin. And they either migrated from Somalia or from, other places, in Africa, and they actually formed they are actually musallis in these masajid, majority of them. Now, also we must acknowledge the presence of the Sufi presence in Natal. The most outstanding of the Indian immigrants to Natal was Ghulam Muhammad, and Sufi, better known as Sufi Sahib. It was Ghulam Muhammad Sufi, actually, better known as Sufi Sahib, who arrived in 1895 at the instruction of his teacher, Habib Ali Shah, to settle in South Africa in order to fulfill the spiritual needs of the newly settled Muslim community. And he was an amazing person. He established the Riverside Khanka, the Sufi center where he resided, and 12 other institutions throughout Southern Africa. Amazing how he managed to do that. But he did. It's still there. All these 12 institutions are still there. Faithfully, he served his community for 15 years until his death in 1911. But he is still fondly remembered by Muslims in South Africa, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, as a wali, a man of Allah, who dedicated his life to the improvement and reformation of the lives of Muslims. The contributions of Muslims in education, social, welfare, and health sectors. Now we're talking about Natal, in the Natal province, in the province of Natal, or KwaZulu-Natal today. The Indian Muslims in Natal established madaris for their children to be instructed in the religion of Islam. So what happened, the Indian Muslims, they wanted to preserve Islam. So they would send their children to the normal school in the day. Then when the school closes about 2:30 or 3 p.m., then they go to the madaris And there is where they are, you know, they receive the Islamic education. And it's, until today, it's still being done until today. They recruited teachers from India to teach their children. So, or, as you know, initially they did that, but today we don't import, you know, teachers from India anymore. In the early 20th century, young Muslims traveled, and they traveled to India to study at the Darul Uloom's Islamic theological institutions. So in the early 20th century, many of them left, and they came back, and they came back, and then they fulfilled the role of imams in the masajid, the role of teachers in the Darul Ulooms. They established their own Darul Ulooms in South Africa. So today, very rarely people would go to India, Darul Ulooms, to study Islam. There are quite a number of Darul Ulooms already in existence in South Africa. Since 1947, so the Muslims contributed substantially financial contribution towards the establishment of state-aided schools for the Indian community. They actually, since 1947, the state aided, so they would provide money on their side, and then the government would come in and also help. So for the Indian community, so because they actually realize the importance of education. So today we have professionals in every field, and they are top professionals as doctors and lawyers, and in various fields, accountants and so on. So they also so the Muslims, they donated generously to universities and technicons which served the general Indian population. And again, we have to understand that at that time, during the apartheid era, they had several universities, but they were segregated on the basis that they had Indian universities, African universities, white universities. The University of Kwazulu Natal, where I am actually, it was the merger of the Indian University, the University of Durban Westville, and the University of Natal. They merged together, and then they formed the University of Kwazulu Natal, and that is the province where we actually reside, where the university is. So in 1963, the Muslims donated for the, contributed financially for the establishment of the University of Durban Westville. And also there was a famous Muslim, Emer Sultan Technicon. He contributed there. He was an indentured laborer, Indian laborer from Malabar, South India. Then we have the M.A. Mutala, established in 1939, a hostel for delinquent Indian boys, and built and financed several schools. He donated the land to the Natal Blind Society for the building of a home and vocational training center. Again, it was not only dedicated for Muslims, but it was for the Indian, because at that time we were segregated. We always have to remember why was it Natal Indian Blind Society, because we are segregated. The A.M. Mullah Charity Trust contributed to social welfare, provided scholarships and bursaries, donated generously to schools and universities, mosques and madaris, hospitals and clinics, hostels and orphanages, libraries and social centers for Indians. To the Muslims, from the time they set here in South Africa, they had, education at the back of their mind. That is an important weapon that we have for the future, our future in this country. So this is, important. So they contributed, and they, financially, to see that Islam, that the Muslims, as well as the other population, if you want to say, they receive education and so on. Then we come to the establishment of hospitals. Now, the first, private Indian hospital was the Shifa Hospital. It was in August 1968. Then we have Advocate Rahim Karim Khan, formerly of Bombay. He contributed to educational projects, many educational projects, but also donated large sums of money for healthcare. The establishment of the R.K. Khan Government Hospital in 1969 in Chatsworth, Durban, was named after him. The R.K. Khan Hospital and Dispensary Trust donated 50% for the establishment of that hospital. 50%. So you can see, and then the government came in with the other money, but you see, Muslims contributed. And this is the beauty of the Muslims of South Africa. They were there financially, they never hold back, but they help, for the social welfare of the community and the other population. Then we had the Basme Adab established to promote Urdu language. So now it's not so vibrant today, the Basme Adab. It's not so vibrant for the Urdu language, but before it was, but not no more now, because Muslims hardly speak the Urdu language in South Africa. When we had a Muslim orphanage was established in 1934 by the name of Darul Yatama Masakin, House of Orphans and Destitute, and this is still in existence today. And then we have the Islamic Medical Association of South Africa. They established, they were the first founders of that private Ahmad al-Qadi private hospital. I don't know whether you know him. He was a famous, Egyptian doctor, or a cardiothoracic surgeon who lived in America, in Florida. Then he came over to South Africa, and he helped establish the Islamic Medical Association of South Africa, and that's why the hospital was named after him, Ahmad al-Qadi Private Hospital. So it's 26%, is owned by the IMASA, or Islamic Medical Association of South Africa. Independent shareholders, they own the others. They contributed 74%. The hospital commenced operation in April 2017. Then we have the Association of Muslim Schools. Now this is also significant, and they have that 71 schools nationally and encompass both primary and high school education as independent and state-aided schools, with the aim of enabling Muslim schools to deliver an Islamically based education of the highest standard and quality. So we have Muslim private schools throughout South Africa, and this is also something for us to be proud of. Now, here I say negotiating the identity. Why? Because for a brief period after their arrival in South Africa, the Indian Muslim traders hoped to be classified as Arabs, so that they could enjoy the same status as British subjects of the colony. So they were initially known as Arabs, but eventually, they wanted to be classified as that. But this did not materialize, since the white traders began a campaign against them. They realized that it would be in their own interest to stay within the broader Indian community. And that is why then the Muslims were assimilated, and were known as Indians. They were known as Indians. So the Muslim part of it, was subsumed by being known as Indian. So it struggled for their rights. The Indian indentured laborers or workers lived in dismal conditions. Indian traders were viewed as economic competitors by the British, and thus made it difficult for them to acquire residential and trading rights. Indians were the first victims of xenophobia in South Africa, and there was known many of them died in 1949 Durban riots. The Indian Committee, Durban, was established in 1894 to pursue these rights for Indian traders, and the majority of whom were Muslims. This committee gave birth to the Natal Indian Congress. This is what came to be known as the Natal Indian Congress. This explains why the earlier Congress leaders were Muslims. Abdullah Ismail Kaji, the Natal Indian Congress, Morbi Kalchalia, the Transvaal Indian Congress, and Dr. Yusuf Dadu, also Transvaal Indian Congress. And what people may not know is that Mahatma Gandhi was responsible for the founding of the Natal Indian Congress, was actually brought to South Africa to represent a Muslim firm, the Dada Abdullah and Company. in a civil lawsuit against another Muslim firm, Tayyib Haji Khan Muhammad and Company. So Mahatma Gandhi, in the contribution that he made in South Africa, you know, it would never have happened if this Muslim family did not bring him over, because he was a lawyer qualified in England. They brought him from India. They brought him here to fight the case. And this is how he made a mark in South Africa. For the first half of the 20th century, Indians and Africans enjoyed a harmonious relationship. The ANC and Indian Congress held regular joint meetings, exchange ideas, information, work together for civic rights. So the ANC was the political organization which is in power today and has been in power from the time 1994 when Nelson Mandela became the first president of South Africa. So there was always harmonious. We find that the Muslims were actually very instrumental, in harboring them against the whites. They even put them home, they hid them and so on. They helped them and helped, the ANC in the struggle for freedom in South Africa. And the Group Areas Act came in 1950. It prevented them from obtaining credits from white-owned banks, so that the Indians could not, because of the Group Areas Act, they could not obtain credits from white-owned banks. Enforcement of separation between races created hostility and suspicion between them. And this is a problem that happened, And many Muslims sacrificed their wealth, education, and family life for the sake of freedom, justice for all South Africans. So this is, indelible mark of our history of Islam in South Africa, is that the Muslims actually sacrificed their wealth, education, family life for the sake of freedom, justice for all South Africans.
Dr. Fadl, can I give you 5 more minutes so that we can go for...
Yeah, I'm going to finish, So for one century, the Indian Muslims maintained emotional bond with India, a change of heart. Now we're talking about, they longed to visit the Indian villages where their ancestors originated. They published the views and news which carried a number of articles on Indian politics. From 1960 onwards, Muslims began to identify with the Muslim world. This is where they stopped using Indian Muslims. They no more visited the children. They don't visit India anymore. But they realized that they are Muslims first, South African Muslims, because in 1961 they accorded South African citizenship. Muslim leaders and intellectuals began to seek acceptance on the basis of their faith rather than their ancestry. The emergence of Muslim organizations were instrumental in changing the mindset, which resulted in their viewing themselves as South African Muslims and members of the global Muslim community. So we have some of the Muslim activists here. Okay, we will send you this PowerPoint. You can know some of them. And then we have the female political activists. All right, the famous one also is Fatima Mir in Natal. And then Muslim government today, the Naledi Pandor, perhaps you don't know, she's a Muslim. She's the current Minister of Foreign Affairs. And the other one, Ebrahim Patel at the bottom there, is also the current Minister of Trade and Industry. Now, Converse for Islam. So this is, Islam grew by 6-fold from 1991 to 2004 through conversion. And they have the Islamic Dawah movement, the African Muslim Agency, and so on. They propagate. Even the Muslim Youth Movement of South Africa and the Call of Islam all were, contributed to the spread of Islam in South Africa. So then we cannot make the talk on Islam in South Africa complete without mentioning Sheikh Ahmed Didat, rahimahumullah. He was the founder of Islamic Propagation Center International. He spent a lifetime of struggle to propagate Islam and to defend Islam against the onslaught of the missionaries. He suffered a stroke in 1996 and was robbed of his most powerful weapon, the gift of speech. He was, in essence, the face of Islam in South Africa. Then we have Muslim political parties. All these failed. And just the last one is known as Al Jama'ah political party. It has made inroads now for the first time from 2019, winning its first national representative becoming the first Islam-affiliated party to do so, as well as one seat in the Western Cape legislature. So the conclusion, the legacy of Islam in South Africa can be summed up through its adherents' active role in the adopted country. So when the Muslims came here, they came here to stay and contribute for the development of the country. Muslims participated in the struggle for the liberation of South Africa from the clutches of apartheid regime. Their willingness in providing moral and material support to Muslim causes all over the world. The support for Palestinians against the Israelis, Bosnians against the Serbs, Chechens against Russia, Afghans against the Soviets, Iraqis against US-led invasion. The involvement in humanitarian aid to African countries and beyond by Waqful Waqifin, Islamic Relief, Al-Imdad Foundation, and so on. So they had in Somalia, Rwanda, Mozambique, Malawi, Kenya, Turkey, Syria, Pakistan, everywhere they made them financial assistance in African schools. For example, the Haji Ahmad Muhammad Loka Trust and Ikra Trust continue to build schools and classrooms in providing teaching aids for African pupils. So shukran. So this is the end of my talk. All right, so I will be happy to take questions if you wish to ask questions. Shukran. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello?
Hello.
Is you there? I just stopped sharing my PowerPoint. I stopped sharing. Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
All right.
Assalamualaikum, Dato.
Yeah.
Now,
Yes,
Dato, Prof. Fadl want to open to the floor.
Yeah.
Go ahead, proceed, Dato.
Okay, guys. There is a Professor Fawzan, Dr. Fadl. He's the
Assalamualaikum.
director of Triparty here. Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Fadl. So very informative talk about the Muslim in South Africa. I think we understood that the struggle of more than 500 years of the Muslim in South Africa, and you could see the success and what you see the Muslim now, and you see they are more united. Although originally the Muslim there were the Malays were brought by the Dutch in the 16 something from Indonesia, Batavia, and you mentioned a few from Malacca, I think maybe from Malacca at that time when the Dutch were colonizing Malacca and the Indonesian part. And now